Convinced that my guest knew a great deal about this Tamerlane, I asked him for more insight. I had heard that Tamerlane had been maimed by arrow wounds to his hand and leg. How could his armies accept a lame man as their leader? A fair question, he answered. It is said that Tamerlane and his fellow tribesmen agreed to decide who would lead them by a foot race. Although Tamerlane's men ran more swiftly, he cast his cap onto the stake marking the goal, and thus won the race. This man seemed cunning as a fox, a dangerous adversary for any commander. I asked my guest to continue his tale. Tamerlane gazed southwest to Persia, a land torn by strife ever since the fall of the Khanate. Persia was vast, its terrain a challenge to any ambitious conqueror. It would not be easy to take. Tamerlane, however, could count on the support of his ally Toktamish, who had reunified the Golden Horde. Together, they would ride down the squabbling Persian kingdoms. Toktamish's betrayal brought Tamerlane to a rare burst of fury. The man that he had regarded as a son, for whom he had sweated and bled, had stabbed him in the back. Tamerlane was forced to halt the Persian campaign to cope with this treachery. Thousands of battle-hardened cavalrymen ceased their pillaging and thundered northwest through the steppe to the lands of the Golden Horde and its allies in Russia. As if foreshadowing the tale to come, the snow of early spring began to fall outside. Winters lasted a long time in these parts, and even the nobles in the hall, clad in their furs, shivered. Tamerlane's vengeance was fearsome to behold, the man whispered. The blasts of wind intensified, snuffing out some of the torches within the hall. Servants bustled about, tending to the meat roasting over the fire. The scent of cooked birds, game, and mutton filled the air. This was the first time that Tamerlane's forces had ventured into Europe. The winters were harsh, and Toktamish surely hoped that the biting cold and far-flung supply lines would prove too much for the wily tactician. The armies of the Golden Horde burned crops and took all they could carry as they retreated. Toktamish knew that Tamerlane would show no mercy. Terrifying reports reached his ears of torched villages and mountains formed from the bones of the slain. Wherever Tamerlane went, it seemed that flock of carrion birds were never far behind. Entire towns surrendered upon hearing of the brutal destruction of one of their neighbors. Toktamish had no choice but to engage the rampaging forces of his enemy. The armies met near the banks of the Kondarcha River sometime during the early weeks of the summer. Crows and vultures circled above the field, and ominous foreshadowing of the carnage to come. Raging fires, torrents of blood, piles of ash, the clash of iron, and the screams of the dying. These were the horrors that Tamerlane visited upon the cities and people of the Golden Horde. The cities of Ryazan, Sarai, Astrakhan, Azov, and Ukek were reduced to rubble. All that remained, aside from the ruins, were the towers of bones that were built from the corpses of the dead. Those who survived were driven like sheep to march in unspeakable cold. Toktamish had no choice but to flee west to Lithuania. Tamerlane was determined not to let the traitor escape, but word soon reached him of a rebellion within his homeland. Leaving the hunt in the hands of two of his generals, Tamerlane swiftly returned home to restore order. at the point of a blade. Listening to the stories of the stranger had stirred our appetites, and we eagerly began to devour our meal. I invited the old man to sit next to me. I still thought that this Tamerlane was more myth than man. Surely he had been beaten in a battle at least once. The man has the cunning of a wolf and the composure of an owl. In some battles he strikes hard at the center of the enemy line, while in others, swift horsemen outflank the opposition. Then they feign a retreat to bait the enemy into a trap, a storm of arrows. When Tamerlane decided to cross the Khyber Pass into India, a different and terrifying challenge faced him. The armies of the Delhi Sultanate ruled the battlefields through the powerful elephants, monstrous beasts known to crush a horseman with a single foot. Drawing up his lines, the clever warlord waited to spring his latest trap. The Indian army relied on the charge of its dreaded elephants to shock their enemies and drive them into disorder. No stranger to the art of war, Tamerlane knew this. In a stroke of genius, he loaded the camels in his baggage train with straw and wood and set them aflame, whipping them toward the enemy lines. The sight terrified the elephants, who doubled back and trampled their own men. The battle was a rout. 200 years' worth of Indian treasure was loaded onto a train of wagons and carried back to Samarkand. In response to an uprising, Tamerlane's armies reduced the jewel of northern India to a charnel house. Death and fire mingled in a putrid stench that enveloped Delhi for weeks. Still, Tamerlane was not satisfied. There was unfinished business to the west. Silence gripped the court as the narrative evoked fear and awe. The meal had been finished for some time, and the fires were beginning to die low. If Tamerlane turned west, he surely would have collided with the mighty Ottoman Empire. Would he even dare to do such a thing? For some time, the local Turkoman tribes of the Levant had been requesting aid against Ottoman aggression. With his army rested and his coffers full of Indian riches, Tamerlane was ready for more bloodshed. He knew there was more than one way to motivate an army. Religious fervor and promises of land and plunder drove his men forward. This land was familiar with the terror of previous invasions, but nothing could prepare them for the onslaught that lay ahead. Thirsting for glory, Tamerlane's armies flooded across mountains, plains and rivers to terrorize Armenia, Georgia and the Levant. Tamerlane's forces ran rampant, looting and burning as they went. For a land that had only recently experienced the plague, this scourge must have seemed to signal the end of the world. Although he was known for his military campaigns, Tamerlane was also a patron of the arts. When a city was sacked, the artisans and scholars were spared and sent to his capital at Samarkand, where they created a vibrant blend of cultures. Populations who resisted him, however, were no stranger. After his siege had broken the Armenian fortress of Van, Tamerlane ordered its inhabitants hurled from the crags. Just like Hulegu, roughly a century before, Tamerlane showed particular cruelty to the city of Baghdad. Each man in Tamerlane's army was required to bring him 2 heads. The warriors slaughtered the population of the city, then slew the prisoners they had brought with them, It is said that to satisfy Tamerlane's command, some even slew their own wives. For the survivors of this savagery, it seemed as if the sun would never rise again. The relationship between Tamerlane and the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid was one of great enmity. The two of them had been exchanging scathing letters for years. Finally, Tamerlane had the opportunity to crush his rival, whose armies were weary from wars in Byzantium and Hungary. Even so, the Ottoman Empire was no trifling opponent, its army driven by intrepid leadership and the power of its Janissaries. The Ottoman force marching to meet Tamerlane was large, but divided. Turks, Serbs, Tatars, and various other vassals all contributed troops to this powerful yet volatile force. If some of them could be pried away and convinced to defect, the tide would turn in Tamerlane's favor. This would be his greatest test yet. The fate of two empires hung in the balance. The Battle of Ankara was a catastrophe for the Ottomans. Never before had they suffered the disgrace of having the Sultan captured in battle. Turning his armies around, Tamerlane left Anatolia in chaos. It is only a matter of time before he seeks another victim. The man ended his tale on that foreboding note. I realized that I had to prepare my kingdom lest my lands appear ripe for the picking. I ordered everyone to retire to their quarters. We would discuss this new danger in the morning with clear and ready minds. Suddenly, the doors burst open, and a servant rushed towards me. "Sire, a messenger from the Waldrot called Tamerlane is here to speak to you. He claims that you are harboring someone of interest to him." I turned to the old man who had not heard the messenger and asked for his name. His weary, dark eyes met mine, and he answered in a grim voice. "I am Toktamish Khan, of the blood of Genghis Khan, and the rightful ruler of the Golden Horde. Landless and friendless, all I have left is my tale."
A blue wolf took as his spouse a fallow doe. They settled at the head of the Onon River to raise their offspring, and there were born the Mongols. So begins my life's work, the secret history of the Mongols. I have been selected to compose this epic because great events are about to take place. We are going to leave Mongolia. I have lived always on this frigid, dry, and endless steppe. The tribes here squabble like vultures, fighting over the desiccated corpse of a marmot. We fight over limited resources, scarce water, few trees, sparse grass for our herds to graze on. A wise and dangerous man named Temujin means to change all this. He says that if the tribal conflict is to end, the Mongols require but two things. First, we need green pastures for our herds. With more to go around, there will be less competition among tribes. Second, we are a culture of warriors. We need a common enemy with which to do battle. To meet both these needs, Temujin has come up with the most modest of schemes, to unite the tribes and go to war with anyone who stands in our path. How, we ask him, how can nomadic horsemen in felt tents embark on a campaign of world conquest? Temujin replies that we will not fight as warriors, but as a unified army. We fight not for personal glory, but for the glory of the Horde. And with those words, the name of Temujin has passed into almost obscurity. His name is replaced with the title Great Khan, Genghis Khan. Nearly all of the Mongol tribes have united under the Great Khan. The chieftains of those tribes reluctant to join were boiled alive. Each day, new faces have taken up the bow. Unfamiliar hands hold the 9 bands of yak hair that has become Genghis' standard. There are more men and horses gathered in the camp than I ever knew existed. Horse archers and lancers, men in leather cuirass and silk armor, all lift their heads upward to the platform from where Genghis speaks. The great Khan calls himself the punishment of God. Men smile like hungry wolves. It is dawn on the first day of the Mongol Empire. Winter has come to the steppes. The earth is frozen hard as bone, and the only movement is the steam rising from the nostrils of men and horses. Only the promise of battle brings warmth. Nearly all of the tribes in Mongolia now answer to Genghis Khan, but with success comes enemies. A man named Kushluk has challenged Genghis's right to rule. Kushluk sows discord among the Karakatai Khanate and means to have himself proclaimed as a rival Khan. Genghis cannot allow these transgressions to go unpunished. He needs to set an example. So we ride west to find and slay Kushluk. If the Karakatai shelter him, then their lives are forfeit as well. Genghis Khan knows that there are weapons aside from the lance and bow. He is a master of mental warfare. Just as he has made an example of Kushluk, he makes examples of enemy lands. When we first encounter a new adversary, the great Khan spares no one. We ride to the closest town, slay every living thing, burn down the city, sow the fields with salt, and make a mountain of enemy skulls. After that, the other towns are quick to send forth their emissaries, eager to placate the ravenous Mongol hordes. Now, all of Mongolia is in the grasp of Genghis Khan. Beyond are two vast empires, China to the east and Persia to the west. Persia is the sensible choice of battle, since it separates us from the rich forage pastures in Europe. But first, Genghis Khan has another score to settle. After witnessing the power of our cavalry in action, the Chinese spoke of nothing but peace. They even promised support for our campaign westward. But now that we have turned away from China, they have decided not to deliver the men and arms they promised Genghis. It is time for another demonstration. Persia can wait as the horde wheels east once more, and we prepare to march into China, the largest, most advanced empire in the world. It was a glorious slaughter. For years, visitors to China will be astounded by the mountain of human and horse skeletons that we have erected. Genghis's horde has gained one huge advantage by this invasion of China: technology. We now possess the knowledge and equipment to allow us to make siege weapons. We will crack open the Persian and European castles to reach the softer parts within. Genghis is pleased with our progress and with the legacy he leaves behind. His mother once ate wild onions and rodents to keep from starving, but the children and grandchildren of Genghis will eat off plates of Persian gold. Sleep in the saddle, drink the rain, eat nothing but dried meat, dried milk, and horse blood. Such is the life of a Mongol at war. At night, we are rewarded with fermented yak's milk and the promise of Persian treasures. Driven on by the words of the great Khan, we have crossed miles of the Asian continent at full gallop. Before us lies the vast empire of Persia. The Khwarezm Shah will be given one chance to submit, and then his cities will be pulled down brick by brick. But not all of us head into Persia. Genghis has sent Sobotai Batur of the reindeer people north into Russia. The Russian principalities are disorganized, and Genghis hopes that Sobotai can break them one by one. Then the horde will rule all of Asia.